What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Compile Swift podcast. This week, we are going to be talking about some AI tools and our experiences with those. But first of all, Jeff, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good. I've been pretty productive on my apps lately and, hoping to stick around and get another podcast out.
Awesome. Yeah, this week, I'm hoping to be productive as well, and we're going to get a podcast episode out for sure. We took a break last week, folks. We had some things we both needed to take care of, and hey, that's the way it goes, right? You can't do everything every week, even when you try hard. And Lord knows, as developers, we try hard. I did spend a live stream, in fact, 2 live streams as of this recording, with an AI tool. We're going to get into it, and it shocked me, is the short version. We're going to be talking about some AI tools this week that we think are helpful to developers. Some of them are specifically geared toward developers and tuned for that, and others are AI tools that you'll be familiar with probably, that are just general tools that we also think are useful. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, who's going to go through a couple here and some of his experiences.
Yeah, so I think the most general set of tools that people are going to be familiar with are just your standard AI chatbots. You've got your ChatGPTs, you got Claude by Anthropic. I think there's a couple of other ones out there that people are using to do development stuff that aren't necessarily geared towards development, but are still very useful for these cases. You can ask ChatGPT or Claude or whatever to generate code for you, and it will do it. It will spit out code, and you are kind of responsible for doing everything on your own after that. I find it personally more helpful to kind of have a conversation about code rather than have this stuff generate code for me, where it's more, I'm trying to figure out a problem. I know that I need to do X, Y, Z kind of thing, and I'm going to describe it from a higher level. Now, you, chatbot, can you help me accomplish this kind of path? Can you walk me down this path? Can you be my guide rather than doing it for me? And I think that is a goal that some of these tools have, is to just replace it outright. But for a lot of these more chat-based tools, I think that they are geared towards, chat, having a conversation and having a back and forth with these kinds of things. And to that end, you have tools that kind of put a nice front end on some of these kinds of things and make it more useful for developer stuff. We have a friend of the show and former guest, Adam Wolf, made a very cool app for this called Developer Duck. We'll link that in the show notes. And that was just a front end to all of OpenAI's models that kind of puts a nice developer-friendly front end on some of these tools, but still is very much geared towards being a chat tool rather than being a integrated AI IDE, like some of the tools that we might talk about later. So I've used these tools minimally. I've definitely used them a little bit. And like I said, I use it a lot for the kinds of things where I know what I need to do, but I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that. For example, I recently had to do a lot of math stuff for one of the things that I'm implementing in Bark, one of the new barcode formats that I'm working on. And I am not a math expert in any way, shape, or form. And what I did was I kind of basically said, hey, I know I need to do this. I need to solve this kind of problem. How am I going to represent this in code? And I didn't want it to automatically just go like, oh, here's the solution, because I can't check that. My skills at math are not well enough that I can look at the code and go, oh yeah, that's absolutely correct. I want it to walk me through step by step and say, you need to solve this. This is how you're going to solve this part of the problem. Then you need to solve this. Here's how you're going to solve this part of the problem, and kind of build it up from steps like that. Does that make sense?
It does, because that is sort of one of the 2 ways that I use these tools. I'll quickly describe how I use them before we dive into sort of tool-specific discussions. So I do like the idea of this chat tool that I can have a discussion with, in a sense, kind of pair programming the problem without being specific. Just to say to it sort of, hey, here's the problem, am I on the right track? and see what it says. Because I agree with you. Things like, math and those kind of things, by no means am I an expert. So if I need a math formula, or I just thought of another good one, maybe a regex, something like that, I'd love for it to generate that part. Then I can take that part and apply it to my code, right? Now that's sort of my first way of doing things. The second way that I use these tools, and this is one that I'll talk about when we dive into the tools here in a moment, is letting it generate code for something that maybe I'm not familiar with, that I can learn from. But the important focus there is to learn from it and not just, okay, the code must be good because the machine said it was. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. That actually ties almost in reverse into another way that I use one of these tools that actually I forgot about until just now, which is finding code on the internet that does something, and then you're not understanding what that code is doing in the first place. You can then take that code, send it to these chatbots, and go, can you explain to me what is happening here? And so last year, this was, over a year ago at this point, I was working on some machine learning stuff. It's ironic that this is all kind of just layered in on top of each other. I was working on some machine learning stuff, and I didn't really understand what was going on. And being machine learning stuff, all of the sample code that's out there is in Python. Using libraries like Python's NumPy. All of the Python people are going to be yelling at me that's not how it's pronounced. I have no idea how it's pronounced. Using NumPy, using some of the specialty math stuff that does. And so there was a lot of, I was taking that Python code that I was finding on the internet and going, please explain to me in English and or in Swift what the heck this code is doing. And finding it very useful to understand that, where if I'm looking at some Python code, and I have a base level of familiarity with Python, but I definitely don't have any familiarity with some of these more esoteric libraries like NumPy, that I could take that code and I could send it to an LLM like this and go, walk me through what this is actually doing. And it would do that, and that was a way that I could then understand what it's doing and then re-implement it myself in Swift, or re-implement it in my own code base and tweak it the way that I needed to in order to make it fit. And that was very helpful. That was something where it's like, I found this code that does what I want to do, but I don't want to just copy and paste it because A, it may not fit my use case one-to-one exactly, but also I just don't like having code in my code base that I don't understand. And so very much it's like, I found this code, I want to take it off the internet, I want to use it, but I don't understand it. Can you help walk me through it? And so I think that's another place where these kinds of tools are very useful. You can have it talk to you about a piece of code, whether it's your code or somebody else's code.
No, right. It's like you say, it's a pair programming technique, I think, in many ways, and also useful, as you say. It hadn't occurred to me until you mentioned it, but it is a great way to get started saying, hey, here's this thing in this language, I need it to be in this language, figure that out for me, and then, like you say, take that, put it in the context of what you need, and also learn from it from there, because that, for me, actually would be a great way to learn something like Python, where I really don't know hardly anything at all, but I know the concept of what I need.
And then I think the one remaining use case that I've used this for, this is a way dumber use case than any of the rest of them, is simply, I know that this API exists, but I can't remember what it's called. And Apple's documentation is, we're all familiar with Apple's documentation. And I just search is not working. I can't find what I need. My Google foo is bad. I can't find this, or it's something obscure, but I know it exists. And just being able to go in and ask the LLM, hey, I'm trying to do this thing, and I know that it exists, but what is the API I'm looking for? And it's really good at being a kind of like nice, fancy search tool. And it'll go like, oh yeah, you just need to call this method. And it's not writing the code for me. It's not generating a big, giant chunk of code. It's going like, hey, here's the one line you need. And you can kind of solve the rest of the problem from there. And so that's another thing that I find really useful, where it's like, I know that I can do this, and I'm just blanking on how to do it. And Google search isn't helping me. Apple's documentation isn't helping me. What is it that I need to do to get there? These tools have been super good. This is especially true in cases where you're talking about something old or obscure. The big one that this helped me with recently was AppleScript. I was implementing AppleScript in a Mac app that I was working on, and all of the AppleScript documentation was written 20 years ago. Apple's documentation search likes to hide it. Google, if you ask it about something that's happened 20 years ago, it's like, 20 years ago, that didn't happen. That doesn't exist. What are you talking about? Google is like, super against showing you anything older than a couple of years. So, yeah, it's impossible to find anything. You go to the LLM, and you're like, hey, I have this question about how I implement an AppleScript function in my app. And it goes, oh, yeah, you just do this. And it doesn't complain about the fact that, oh, who's writing AppleScript in 2024? I am. Deal with it. It just gives you exactly what you need. So.
Yeah, and I think that it raises what you say there raises a very important point here, which is regardless of the tool that you use, and by that I mean whether it's a AI chatbot, Google search, or whatever it may be, at the end of the day, you still need to know what the question is that you need to ask and how to ask it. And I think AI does a better job at helping you figure out how to phrase that question, right? Because, like you say, we've all sat there putting a bunch of stuff in a search engine, and it's just not working, however you try to phrase the question. But I think with AI, sometimes I've found that the experience is it sort of figures out what you mean, but it's like, I see what you're trying to say, but you don't have the words. Let me help you out. Did you mean this? Yes, that's exactly what I meant. And I do like this idea of, I have the knowledge. I can't remember the name of this API. And of course, as soon as it tells you, you're like, oh yeah, that's it. And then you remember, oh, I now remember how I used it. So that is a good use case as well.
Yep. Or it gives you the jumping off point to go into Apple's documentation and go, okay, now what's the specifics about this? What is, now that I know what class I'm looking at, what are its functions, what are its whatever, it gives you another point to kind of jump off and do more learning.
And I guess the takeaway lesson here is, now that you put it out there, is let's hope that they didn't train the AI services they're going to put in Xcode on the documentation. Otherwise, all hope is lost, right?
Let's hope they do, and then that gives them an excuse to make better documentation.
Yeah. Or maybe at that point the machine takes over. It's like, look, I got this. What's up, everybody? I want to tell you about Clean My Mac by MacPort. Now, I have been using this for years, so many years that I don't even remember at this point. But if you're a Mac user and you don't have this tool, trust me, you need it. So let me tell you what you can do with this. Now, when I open up the application, not only is the UI absolutely gorgeous, but I run SmartCare, and all I got to do is open the app, click on SmartCare, and hit the scan button. Now, when I do that, what's going to happen, it's going to analyze my system, and it's going to go through, and it's going to look for junk. It's going to check to make sure that I don't have any malware or anything like that on my Mac. It's going to run some performance checks. It's going to go through and check for application updates. And then it's also going to give me the option to look at what I would call the clutter on my machine. Kind of my files, right? The stuff that I put there. And I'm not kidding you, every time I run this, and I run this at least once a week, it will find at least a couple of gigs worth of junk files to clean out. And all I got to do is to tell it, go ahead and run, and it'll clean out the junk files. The other day when I ran it, it found 6 gig of files. And believe me when I tell you, I am meticulous about keeping junk off of my machine. And it will just find this stuff splattered all over different folders. and then it'll run the performance checks, like I say, and it'll just look and see if there's anything that it thinks needs to be done. It'll let me know about any app updates, and I can just have it update them for me. Now, on top of that, there are other tabs. There's the cleanup tab, and it'll go in there, and you can tell it to do various cleanup operations for you. Again, it's going to run an analysis. As developers, we all know about Xcode and how much space it takes up, but you will be amazed about the amount of files that can build up in caches over time that you just don't think about, and they just don't clean themselves up very well. And again, it'll go through there and save me gigabytes of space. It's absolutely unbelievable. The performance tab is fantastic. It'll run things like flushing the DNS for me, and it'll run the maintenance scripts. It'll check disk permissions for issues there, and all of those things to give you every ounce of performance out of your machine. And if all of this sounds good to you, and it should if you're a Mac user, like I say, I consider this like one of my first installs. You can go to peterwiedom.com/CMM, and that's going to jump you to the right spot where you can go in and you can try out Clean My Mac. You'll get a 7-day free trial. Personally, like I say, every time they bring out a new version, it's an instant upgrade for me. So again, go to peterwiedom.com/CMM and get started with Clean My Mac today.
So then as kind of like a half step between purely chat-based tools that aren't really meant for developer stuff and full-fledged developer IDEs that we'll get into later, we have our tried and true, our good friend, Xcode. And with Sequoia and with Xcode 16, you need both. Apple introduced predictive code completion. And that is kind of an expansion of the existing autocomplete that tries to use AI heuristics to give you what you need from a development perspective. And so I think both of us have used this, and I think both of us have kind of come across similar answers, which is that sometimes it's magic. Sometimes it's great, and it just does everything that you absolutely wanted. And other times you're sitting there going, what on earth are you thinking, Xcode? Where did you get this? Why do you think that this is what I want? And it's never really clear which is which and what you're going to get. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but it is, I think, a step towards Apple realizing that, hey, these tools could be useful, and maybe we should start looking into integrating them with our software, and what can we do from there? So what's your experience?
Yeah, so my experience is a mixed bag, and I did start by using it when it was first available in I think it was the betas, right? We had it a little bit before the RCs, and I wasn't expecting miracles, but what I found was it was good. It surprised me in a way that was like, oh, it would suggest things like variable names based on my code and, things along those lines, which were good for helping me think about, variable naming is hard, right? And it did help sort of like, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's go with that, right? Now, that said, in the situations where there was no code, that was definitely one of those, yeah, that's not so great, right? But once there was a bit of coding there, and it was pretty good for me at things like initializers and stuff like that. So it was a mixed bag, but for the most part, I was impressed with it from a first attempt by Apple. That's kind of where I'm at now. Would I just trust it and go with it? No, definitely not. But it was a good way to fill that blank screen, if that helps. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's been my experience as well. It is something that for a lot of the boilerplatey type stuff, like you said, initializers, codable conformance, that kind of thing, it's good. It's not perfect, but it is good, and it certainly deals with it a lot better than some of the refactoring tools that they've had there in the past.
Yeah.
But there are some times where it wants to insert something, and I just go, I don't know why you thought that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah, it didn't so much wrap itself in circles as just went off on a wild tangent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the way they've integrated this is pretty easy to ignore, that it just kind of gives you some ghost code and it shows up and you can very easily ignore it. But, sometimes it just does something so weird that you're like, you just stop for a second and go, what?
Yeah. Yeah. If you think of it as a smart autocomplete tool, it's not too bad.
Yeah, I think that's all it's intended to be. And, it has all of the ups and downs that being a smart autocomplete. That's what we've known about on keyboard autocomplete for forever on iOS.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, it's as good as that. Let's put it that way, folks. All right, good luck with that. Yeah. But that is only step one of the plan for Xcode, right?
Yeah. They announced at WWDC that they would have their own kind of chat adjacent tool called Swift Assist. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen hide or hair of that since WWDC.
Nope, nothing at all.
Yeah, so I don't know that we haven't had any announcements about it. We haven't had any, here's when you might expect to see it. Even, Apple's talked about a lot of the Apple Intelligence features that they've announced, and we start to see some of these coming with image playgrounds in 18.2 and those kinds of things. This one seems to just not really be coming. So I don't know when we expect to see that, or if we expect to see it by next year or what. But yeah, it'd be a nice to have. But as of right now, we're just kind of waiting for it to actually exist.
I think that there's two parts to the problem here, I think, for Apple. Firstly, okay, depends on how you look at it. But in my opinion, they were clearly delayed in their AI services in general, be it developer or consumer. Now, we are starting to see them, as you say, and so far I've been reasonably happy with them. But I think the problem is, with the developer one, this is what happens when Apple announces stuff way back in June, and then we sit here on this promise for the rest of the year, and here we are almost getting ready to start talking about the next conference, and we still don't have what was supposed to be here this time around. And in the meantime, everybody else has, I was going to say caught them up, but I think from the get-go, everybody else had already surpassed them. And I wonder if part of the reason, understandably, is they've not released them because they've looked at it and said, our stuff's just not good enough. But the problem with that is, well, if you hadn't have told us about it in the first place, and it just turned up at some point, we would have been more impressed than the empty promise of a year of waiting, right?
Yeah. And if they're delaying it because it's not good enough, it's not like everybody else has stopped.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's not like everybody else has got it perfect. So at this point, kind of maybe put it out there and not beg for forgiveness, but just say, hey, here it is.
Just get it out there and iterate.
Yeah. At least that's how it feels to me. I've sort of, I don't want to say given up waiting for it. It's like, I'll try it out when it gets here, if it gets here. But in the meantime, there are other routes that I think are probably working better than this unreleased stuff, unless it's truly stunning. I can't see how it could be based on the mixed reviews of the services that are out there now for consumers, which arguably are going to be used a lot more, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So then on the far other end of the spectrum, we have these fully developer-centric IDEs. And I haven't really worked with any of those, but I know you have. And I know that the one that you've interacted with the most is called Cursor. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your experiences with Cursor, what you've used it for, what you've liked, what you haven't liked? Just tell me everything about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to go down two different tracks here for two different tests that I've done. We'll put links in the show notes. I did them on a live stream because I wanted everybody to see it as it happened. And thankfully, there was also some folks in the chat room that had used Cursor before that were able to give me some pointers. Now, let's start with what is Cursor. So, Cursor is essentially Visual Studio Code with some extra smarts on top, is how I would describe it. So, if you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, you're already most of the way there, right? I did a couple of experiments that went along the same lines for two radically different projects. And what I wanted to do was just hand it over to the tool and say, I'm going to do exactly what you're going to tell me to do. This seemed like the best way to go about this. So the two examples, one was a web app using React, and the other one was to build a iOS SwiftUI app. So let's talk about the React one. The way it goes is like this, right? I had an empty IDE, essentially, and a chat window. And in the chat window, you describe what you want. Now, you can be as verbose as you want to be, and I do recommend that, or you can build it up in sections. The way that I went about this was, I'm going to give it an overview of everything I want this app to do. In the case of the web app, right, I went along the lines of something like, I want to build a web-based application using Node, React, Tailwind CSS, MySQL, and TypeScript. I want the application to have a registration screen that uses email and password. I want it to have a profile screen where I can change my password. And I want to have a home screen, essentially, after I've logged in. Plus the ability to, usual crud, right? Delete the profile and so on. And that was it. And at that point, I just hit return. It goes away and thinks about it for a minute. It was pretty quick, I gotta say. And it comes back and says, okay, look, here's a series of tasks I think you need to perform to make this happen. And it's very much working through the tasks and saying, yep, go ahead and do this one. For example, let's take my SQL section. It says, okay, you need to create a database, and it shows me the SQL. And I'm like, yep, go ahead, do that. And it creates, along with the table. It runs that for me, creates that. And then it says, okay, now you need to be able to hook up to that database. So it'll show me some connection code. And I'll say, yeah, go ahead, do that. It'll create a new file with all the connection code and any prompts for things like, passwords and things like that I got to put in. In this case, it took the sensible approach of environment variables, right? So there was that. And then you save these files and you go through this process of creating a series of files based on each of the parts. And it fully explains to you what it's doing. So if you don't know, what's going on here, you can learn from that. The reason I chose this one was I already knew how to do these things. And I wanted to see how well its suggestions matched up with the way that I would have done this. Now, at the end of it, you're going to go through however many tasks for, what you're trying to create. And at the end, it'll say something like, okay, now go ahead and run the app, right? In this case, there was a server part for the Node, and there was a client part for the React side. So I just run them both. And sure enough, hey, it popped up in the browser, and life was not good. The reason being is it's kind of user error a little bit in that I had not set a password on my SQL, if I remember rightly. You go back to the chat box. Again, I wanted to hand it all over to the machine. I told it what the problem was, and you can tell it, here's the problem, and it'll go away and analyze all the files in your project to give itself context and then suggest a solution. And sure enough, it comes back and says, yes, I see the problem. It literally says, yes, I see the problem. It's trying to be friendly. Suggest a solution. Again, you can say, go ahead and do that. Run it again. Great, everything's working now. That was the basics of the web app, right? Now, the only pre-requirements is I did have to have Node installed in MySQL, right? Stands to reason. So that was track number one. Pretty straightforward stuff there, right? In the next stream, I wanted to challenge it further because this is, I was like, well, this thing's not going to be able to do this, right? So I opened up an Xcode, new empty Xcode project, went to the app and said, I want to create a Swift UI application that has a list view with an entry form with various fields. I want to be able to edit a record. I want to be able to, display the list of records, see the details when I tap on one, and that was pretty much it. And the only other thing I said was I wanted to use Swift data, which I thought for sure was going to catch it out. Same process. It goes through and says, okay, here's what we're going to do, series of tasks. Go through and perform those. It creates a series of Swift files inside my Xcode project. I screwed up. It was my fault. It was putting me in the wrong location. I should have set that up beforehand. That's on me. But sure enough, the files that it created were fine, right? The first thing it did was it created the model, a nice model for me. So if you've not done Swift data, this was a great way to see how to create a model in Swift data. And then it created the list view. It created the for loop in there to make the list. It created the tap event the navigation, I should say, for the details view. On the details view, I could actually edit in the screen, go back, it would automatically save because it's Swift data. And I even, as a bonus, it gave me swipe to delete. And it just worked. So, at this point, I was like, well, that was a lot better than I expected. and I know you were there to see this on the stream. And I didn't do anything in between. I literally just let it do its thing. And like I say, some of the mistakes there were human error for sure. I had, learned, okay, point it to the right folder next time so you don't have to move files. That was like the basic experience. And there's a part two that I'll get into in a second, but I want to pause here for any comments or questions from you since you saw this happen.
No, I mean, I saw the full initial thing, and it was a little weird that it didn't really catch up all of the things that you had already set up with regards to the empty Xcode project. But once you had that working, it did basically do everything that it said. You just copied and pasted 4 different files, and it's like, yep, here's your entire app. It's done.
Yeah.
And, is it exactly the code I would have written? No, not at all. But it took the machine 30 seconds when it would have taken me probably close to 30 minutes. So definitely something that is a huge kickstart to a project like this.
Yeah, that is a very important point. That was one of my takeaways that I mentioned on the stream was, okay, it's not done anything I couldn't do myself, but it has done it significantly quicker than I would because, hey, I got to type the code out and it didn't, right? So it is a great time-saving tool for the base plate, mundane code to get you started. And I agree with you. Some of it was like, well, I might not have done it that way, but it got me a running app that I can now start working with significantly quicker. That was the good part. All right. Now, this is where things got interesting because one of the specific things I wanted to do was to challenge it with adding a new feature. I wanted to add this feature where basically there was a screen with a text field, a rich text editor, and you can put text in, that gets stored with it, and you can have it associated with one of the pre-existing records. So I described it, again, what I wanted it to do. I felt I described it pretty good. And sure enough, it analyzed all the files and said, okay, look, here's a bunch of changes we need to make. Created a new model, right, for this new piece of data. And then also created a bunch of files and made changes to the existing ones, which is important because on the one hand, you wanted to update the existing ones, like, for example, adding, the models to the container in the startup of the app and things like that. But it started to generate errors. Now, having been there before when I did the web app, I wasn't too concerned because I knew that the best way to go about this is, yes, I could probably solve them myself, but to trust in the system. And so I would tell in the chat box, I would literally say, hey, in this file, or when I was building, I got this error, or a couple of times I got this crash, right, when it was trying to run. It would go through and almost, would you say it almost felt a little bit smug about the way it was like, oh yeah, I see the problem, right? and I think I was even saying to the screen, no, you created this problem, not me. And so it made suggestions to fix the problem. Again, was like, all right, we're going to go with this, trust in the system. And I started going down, and everything was fine at first. It was building, but there was some issues, so I would describe again some of the things that weren't quite right. But then at that point, we got so far down a rabbit hole of trying to fix these problems that it felt like I was getting caught in a loop and going around solving one thing that generated something else that then broke the first thing, that then fixed the first one, broke the second one. And it started to feel like that after about 30 minutes. Was that your impression as you was watching it, or do you think it was just me?
I think that was at the point where I saw that it was going in circles, and I had other things to do, and so I dropped off at that point. So I was like, oh, okay, this doesn't look good. I don't know what I'm going to be able to do to help. Let me, I got other things that I have to catch up on. So I did unfortunately miss the resolution of all of this.
Okay.
But yeah, I definitely saw where you started to get into points where you were editing files and it was like re-editing them, and you kind of got into a thing where it's like, hang on, we've been here before.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I missed what happened after that. I missed if you ever actually got out of this circle. But yeah, I did catch you getting into the rut.
All right. So, spoiler alert, we did not get out of the circle. If you had come back about, 40 minutes later, we were just in a different part. It's like in England for American drivers when you get on a roundabout and you can't figure out how to get off, we did not solve the problem. But I think the takeaway lesson there, discussing it with the chat room, was if you start with kind of a monolithic, description to build the app and do that, and then try to add features, it's not necessarily going to go great for you. So that is a mark against this particular
which is
tool. Weird,
because it seems like that's what these tools are kind of built for, is having the knowledge of your code base as it is.
Yes.
So it's surprising to hear that. And I know that I've seen, again, we're going to go back to friend of the show, Adam Wolf. I know that I've seen on his streams where he is taking his existing code base, which is huge. He's got a very large code base, and been using stuff like Cursor for that, and using it to add features. And it seems to mostly work fine for him. So I'm a little bit surprised, and I wonder how representative either of your experiences are, honestly. Like, I'm not going to just say like, right, oh yeah, Peter's clearly doing it wrong. But yeah. I also, like, is Adam's project as it exists in a setup where it just works better for some reason? Is it the fact that you were, like you say, using the latest and greatest solely to kind of trip it up? You said that you were trying to do that with having it use Swift data, versus Adam's code base is several years old, and he may be running into problems that he may not be running into problems that you were running into with trying to have the latest and greatest, that the LLM just doesn't know enough about, oh yeah, you can't really do this with Swift data.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, because my takeaway after I sort of thought about it the next day was, okay, first of all, yes, of course, ultimately the AI is drawing from his experiences. So it's only going to know as much as the data is out there. So as far as like referring to Swift data, that's a possibility. And I also think on the flip side, the more it has to draw from in your code base, the better your chances, which is a bit of a weird situation to be in, because here you are with the tool that you're trying to use to build an app to, expand the code base to add the features, yet at the same time, if it can't help you add the features at the beginning, how much is it going to help you later on? And I think that's the weird position we're in with a lot of this stuff at the moment. And I think that's why I was sort of, when we were talking about, the stuff that they're going to put in Xcode 16 earlier was, it's only going to be as good as its input, right? And so I want to say that I don't think that's the definitive experience that I had. I think given that this was only the second time I had used it, which is important to point out because that this is also where I wanted to come from was, hey, I've never used this. If I was, a developer, because let me say this, you should be a developer if you're going to use like this tool. You got to know what it's doing, right? Because you've got to get yourself out of these holes. Because I was thinking, well, this should be a great tool to take one of my existing apps and say, hey, I want to add this new feature, which was this exact scenario. And it didn't do so well, which does leave you questioning, okay, how useful is it, right? But I'm going to give it a passing grade on both of my tests because it certainly did way better than I thought it was going to do.
That's good. It's definitely good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I do want to point out, though, there are some things that some folks in the chat room pointed out. I'm not familiar with them, so I don't want to dive into them here. I might look into it. But it's not integrated in any way with Xcode. It is literally dumping files in your Xcode project.
I did see that, yeah.
Yeah, and so for example, as someone said, an Xcode project file, as much as we don't understand them, it knows even less.
I do actually find that surprising because it's not like there's a dearth of Xcode project files out there on GitHub or whatever that I actually am a little bit surprised that these tools don't understand Xcode project files, maybe even better than Xcode does. And, one of the things that I was hoping that an LLM could do is, everybody's familiar with this where, I've done a git merge and now my Xcode file is broken and now I've got to figure out what exactly is wrong with my Xcode project file. Like, I feel like an LLM should be pretty smart at here's my Xcode project file, find what's wrong and fix it. That seems like the kind of thing that it should know, and to have the experience that, no, actually these tools are just as confused by Xcode project files as we are, seems counterintuitive to my understanding about how LLMs are designed.
I'm sure I do not know what you mean. I have never experienced a merge problem with Xcode project files.
Sure.
If that was a problem, there'd be some other tools out there that would generate Xcode project files or some crazy world like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, you're right. Right. I feel like it should at least have a basic understanding. There's no serious magic in any of these files. And maybe further down the road it will. Be interesting to see if the Apple's version of this understands project files, right?
Definitely.
That would probably be their most outstanding feature if it did. But that was basically over 2 streams, so I'm going to guess about maybe 4 hours. That was my experience with it, and I'm going to say, in my opinion, this is a tool worth thinking about.
Or at least a category of tools worth thinking about.
Sure, absolutely. Let's be fair and say, yeah, because I know there's some others that we're going to sort of touch on. At the end of the day, yeah, that's a better way to put it. These are tools that if you use them to help you, you're going to go a long way with it. Hey folks, if you like what you're hearing in this podcast and you want to help this podcast to continue going forward and having great guests and great conversations, I invite you to become a Patreon supporter. You can go to patreon.com/CompileSwift, where you will get ad-free versions of the podcast along with other content.
Because I know definitely, I've looked at it a couple times, and I've never actually used it. I've never even gone as far as downloading it. Mm-hmm. My concerns about Cursor are not the concerns about what makes Cursor Cursor. My concerns about Cursor are the history that it has with VS Code and my experiences with VS Code.
Yeah, oh, sure.
And so,
yeah.
I know that I've used that in the past, and I used to love it, and now I no longer love it. And so it's more like, what if I could have the Cursor things in a project or in an environment that I actually liked to use? Mm-hmm. Segue.
Beautifully done. Yeah.
Professionally done. Last week at their annual conference, GitHub announced that they were doing their own version of taking over, it's not quite clear to me, the GitHub Copilot for Xcode plugin. Now, this existed before, and I hadn't used it at that point. It now is an official GitHub project. It is now part of the GitHub organization on GitHub. That's confusing to say. It's at github.com/GitHub. But this is now kind of a official from GitHub's end integration between Xcode and Copilot. And it uses some questionable hacks to make it work because Xcode doesn't have a great plugin system. So it is definitely being a little bit tricky in order to get to do what it does. I haven't used this yet. I'm pretty sure you also have not used this yet.
Correct. I haven't used this yet. And you touched on right there, the one concern to me is, well, many concerns, but the most immediate one is because of the restrictions in the Xcode plugin system, how much can this or any tool that tries to integrate with Xcode really do?
Yeah. I do think this is something that I will look into because I think it is interesting and it kind of gets around the issues that I have with VS Code as an editor in allowing me to use Xcode instead. So it might be interesting. I kind of prefer the Claude ecosystem rather than the OpenAI ecosystem. And obviously this isn't really integrated with that yet, being that it's coming from Microsoft and all of their integration with OpenAI. Mm-hmm. But I hope that we will see that eventually. GitHub seems to have been more open to pairing with other model providers. And so I'm hoping that we see something like that in the future where it begins to work with things other than OpenAI's models. And I think that could be another interesting alternative to a tool like Cursor.
You know, one go back I should have added here, just as a note for Cursor, you can choose among many different engines. Mm-hmm. I was using Claude, which is the one it has by default, but there is at the very bottom of the screen a drop-down. Well, you click it and it's a drop-down. So you can choose your engine of choice. Yeah.
That is one thing that I think I like about Cursor more than what we currently have with Copilot for Xcode.
Yeah. I'm eager to see you try that one out. I think I'm gonna sit and watch the train go by on that one and just ride along with you as opposed to diving in.
I should try that out in the future, and maybe we'll do a quick follow-up on the beginning of one of these episodes.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some folks out there that are like, gosh, how many episodes are they going to do on Compile Swift on AI? But the fact is, this is a thing, right? I mean, it's a big thing. It's only going to get bigger. And it's important to stay on top and at least be aware, even if you have no intention of using any of these things, you should at least be aware of what's happening, like I always say, on, around you as far as tools, services, and approaches. And this is for sure an important one. So, AI, right, it's been around a while. We've all heard about it in many different contexts. It's not just for developer tools, and you don't have to use specific developer tools, as far as AI goes. There are other areas where this is important, arguably more important in some ways, depending on your perspective, than helping you write your code. And you actually have a couple of really good examples where you did, you typed into the machine for me, I guess is the way to do it, but it's useful for marketing and other things. But you have a couple of, I think, really good use cases, So you want to go ahead and dive into those?
I think what you're referring to is the icons for your app's Job Finder Tracker and Endless Hurdles. And those were both icons that I did using Midjourney, and kind of starting with a prompt in Midjourney and kind of discussing my way through it and using a lot of Midjourney's tools to kind of tweak the way into it looking the way that you want it to. I think Job Finder Tracker was done kind of early in Midjourney's experience, and you can kind of see it if you look at it a little bit. It's like, oh, yeah, this definitely has some of the weird AI shenanigans around it. Yeah, whereas Endless Hurdles, I think, came later, and they had built more of their tools, and so you can kind of, erase parts of it and say, well, hang on, this doesn't look right. This is not how a fence looks. This is not how a hurdle looks, and let's build something that looks a little bit better. So that one's a little bit cleaner in terms of what it does. And so this is a case where if you want an app icon and you can't afford a true designer who's going to build something custom for you, and you don't have the skills to do it yourself, this is something that gets you a 80% good enough experience with an app icon so that you can actually just have something out there. You can have an app that looks good on the App Store and get you started on your road to being a developer.
Oh, I agree. Like the Endless Hurdles one, when you did that one and I saw it, was an instant like, oh my God, yes. Because it's not something I would have thought of, and I certainly couldn't have done it anywhere near as well. And I just love that one. It's one of those, it's like, yeah, I just want this to be the icon forever, Yeah. You're right about the Job Finder Tracker. It's appropriate for what it is, but it, like you say, it does feel like, maybe revisit this sometime. Mm-hmm. But either way, I think the important point here is, sometimes we think like, oh, the icon or screenshots are going to be easy, and they end up being the hardest thing, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because you have the freedom of choice of doing anything. And I know, having seen you go through and do screenshots, for example, it's like, yeah, you can take these any direction you want, and that's the problem. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that kind of... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's also useful, for the marketing material, right? You can, okay, I can describe on a piece of paper or screen what I think it should say, but I can't necessarily make it sound right. And I can use these tools to play with that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of where I've done with some of the marketing for my most recent app, Bark, is I didn't have it generate anything because, oh man, the stuff it generates on its own is bad. Mm-hmm. And it was funny because I did have it do that once, and I was like, I literally said to the LLM, like, this seems like one of those really tacky Saturday infomercials where it was like the black and white video of you like, have you ever done this?
Yeah.
It was just super tacky. So yeah, definitely don't trust them with, let's just go generate a marketing thing from scratch. But what I did find is similar to what I was discussing at the very beginning of this episode is being able to kind of pair market with it and say, I want to do this. Like, what are the kinds of things that I should be thinking about? What are the aspects of marketing that I need to cover? What are the bare minimum? Here is my budget. Here is my, limited resources. Here is what I've got. What are my priorities? What should I be focused on? What should I really do with, what are the kinds of things that I should be tackling and in what order? And with that, it does a lot better job. It's good at kind of coming up with outlines for you to fill in on your own. If you do something on your own, it is very good at judging you. You can kind of sit here and say like, oh, here, for example, is the App Store description that I've written. And it'll go, well, hey, you probably want to mention this. You probably want to mention that. Here's what you should do to sell your subscription a little harder. Here's what you should do to do this. And I found it to be a lot better at that. Don't let it go off on its own and generate stuff for you because it sounds very LLM driven, very, very tacky. You've all seen like things that are clearly written by ChatGPT.
I was going to say
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. At this point, I think we've all seen enough on many different things to it's like, yeah, we can spot them now, right?
Whereas bringing something that you've had and you've created on your own and having it, not even have it touch it up, but more have it critique you, have it coach you, have it tell you where you need to patch things up. And of course, you also have the ability to tell it no. Like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to say this. I don't want to become too scammy sounding. I don't want to become too markety. But having it kind of give you tips and pointers, I've found that to be really useful in helping with my app marketing.
It's interesting because I have been playing around with Apple's AI services. The text services that you can now get in
the writing tools.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure how I feel about them. They sort of walk that line between this sounds unnatural, Yeah. And so it's interesting that you mentioned that. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely, I think the takeaway from this episode is, look, folks, there's a lot of tools out there that can help you perform whatever task you need to do. And that's how you should look at this. I do think, in my own opinion, that is how you're going to get the most out of these. Be it code in applications or, like we say, the marketing materials, the designs, all of those kind of things. That is definitely use these as an assistant, like I said earlier, pair programming, pair whatever, critique, all of those kind of things. That's going to be the path to, I think, your greatest success on this, right?
Absolutely. All right, Peter, I think that's it for today's episode. Where can everybody find you?
You can find me in person, not AI.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I know. Terrible. You can find me at peterwhedon.com, and you can find this podcast and that at compileswift.com.
And I am at cocotype.com and cocotype on every social media that you can think of in the world. There's always new ones.
All right, folks. Rest assured, we won't be replacing ourselves with AI as hosts anytime soon. The ridiculous, crazy comments that you hear are naturally us and not a machine. All right.
Yep.
That's it, folks. See you in the next episode.